let me just make sure I've got this going the right way. I probably live as far south as you can get, as far as everybody at this conference is concerned. Though in Canada, we would consider this the frozen north. I'm actually living in a wooded area, as you can see, with pretty well nothing around it. And that's my home, little cabin on the lake. One of my English friends decided she wanted to come to Canada and do, after having achieved her PhD, and do what she referred to as snow-based activities in northern Canada. So I invited her to come along. And she wanted to go out snowshoeing, so I got out my snowshoes and lashed her into her snowshoes, loaded all our worldly goods onto a toboggan, and I made her haul them back into the woods many miles from nowhere. And I gave her tea over a fire in a blizzard, and eventually we got to the little cabin where we were going to be staying for the night. And that was all well and good until I took her to the outhouse facilities. And that was a cultural experience in northern Canada on its own. And we were cooped up in our little cabin. Now, all went well until it started to get dark. And then she had to go to the outhouse again. And I had to go along with the axe and lean on the door because she was afraid of wolves. And I seriously thought she was kidding. I mean, she's a grown woman, she was in her 40s, academic, well-educated, all the rest of that, and she was genuinely terrified of the wolves outside the door. I had to load up all the firewood against the door. She had to sleep on the top bunk because of wolves. Now, in Canada and all my time in the north, I've seen 2 wolves way down the lake. I don't think I've ever heard, well, at that point I hadn't ever heard one howling. And I said to her she'd be lucky if she even saw the tracks of a wolf. But no, she was absolutely terrified and insisted on having the top bunk, as I said. So over some medicinal brandy, I decided to find out where this idea had come from. What had she been reading or watching on television? And it turned out that her ideas of Canadian culture and the North came entirely from British girls' school annuals and magazines of the 1950s and 60s. Her idea of the Canadian North was based on Jean of the Wilderness mushing her way to the trading post, followed by the mad trapper and, of course, the wolves. And this had colored her impressions of Canada. Well, eventually, she got to play out some of her fantasies, driving the dog team and all the rest of it, and eventually she went back to London. But that got me thinking, because I hadn't really thought about it before, where do we get our ideas about Canadian wilderness and Canada as North? So there's a large body of scholarship on the significance of North and Canadian culture and identity, and quite honestly, the only people who really care about Canadian identity are Canadians, and not even that many of us. But wilderness is considered a universalizing discourse of nationality. We are Canadian in our common relation to the shared landscape. And no matter what our individual origins, our insertion into this primal territory inscribed on us a shared experience. And the natural world has always been important to Canadians and is a distinct part of their amorphous, difficult to define national identity. My interest is in how children first acquire their ideas about Canada as North. Where did my friend get her ideas? From her magazines. And I centered in the end on school books because I found that there was just too much children's literature, far too much children's entertainment, and it was very difficult to put together a data set that you could be sure that everybody had actually been exposed to. I mean, it's almost impossible, even the most popular books, I mean today, you know, Harry Potter, we can assume all children have read Harry Potter, but have they? Have they seen that particular, do they all watch Country File? I mean, we can assume those things, but it's really almost impossible to know. However, school books are mandated by the government. You have to read them. And they also provide an official perspective. But for many children, textbooks constitute the bulk of the reading material they encounter, particularly through the formative elementary grades. You can't know what they're reading at home. Lots of children don't read for pleasure. The textbook is not just any book, it's an official book, authorized by the government, promoted by the school, acknowledged by the teacher. The textbook carries the imprimatur of authority. As such, it's deemed to contain legitimate knowledge between its covers. It's the approved version of the world considered acceptable for passing on to youth of the nation. And for some social and cultural questions, the influence of the textbook can remain decisive. It's only in later years of their schooling children reach the stage where a mature critical attitude towards what is read may emerge. When this biologically determined uncritical attitude towards textbooks is reinforced by institutional policy, the potential influence of textbook becomes immense. Textbooks are, of course, the reflection of the dominant values of the privileged groups who author them. In this sense, curriculum, textbooks, and other teaching resources are expressions of official ideologies regarding identity, community, and citizenship. And in the case of the books that we're going to be looking at, a large number of the authors and editors are women. It's not just the white middle-class male view of Canada, it's also the white female view of Canada as well. So the data set I ended up using was Canadian school readers used between 1946 and 1980. These were actually instigated by educational publishers and educators. They weren't mandated by a particular government. In fact, education in Canada is provincial, not federal, and there is no national curriculum. It's done effectively by each province or essentially state. However, the academic publishers discovered that they could make an awful lot of money if they could come up with books that could be used across the country instead of only in one set of schools. So the readers I decided to use were for grades 4 to 6, which is children ages 9 to 11. They're sets of graded books. I discounted the earlier books because they were too much of a reading scheme, see, dig, run kind of thing. And the books for older children, the ones for 12 and up, tended to be very thick anthologies, which you couldn't possibly get through in the school year. The books that I'm looking at, the graded books, were designed to be used from September through to June, and you were supposed to cover at least most of it. They were produced by several publishers, but they're amazingly similar in their content and form. And they're anthologies of prose, poetry, and informative articles to interest children and improve their reading. Compiled by leading educators and classroom teachers from across Canada, authorized by provincial ministries of education, and you could only use authorized books in the classroom, otherwise your funding was cut. The long-term influence, some of the books were used for as long as 30 years, which would mean that a child of 10 could easily be teaching from the book that she used when she was 20 or 25 working as a teacher. And they were dominated by Canadian content. So the books I looked at were 4 sets introduced in 1946 to 47, and an additional 6 sets that came into use between 1959 and 1962. And as I say, some of the books were used at least in Ontario to 1979 and in other parts of the country after 1980. So there was a long-term effect. The books were also accompanied by teachers' manuals. And when I was a child, the teachers did have a manual, and it said T or M on the end of it. It looked identical, but and we figured that had all the secret knowledge. That was where that had the answers to the test. That was where all the good stuff was, but they were always kept away from children. I don't know why. The teachers' manuals make it very clear that the readers were designed to improve children's reading and comprehension skills, expose them to high literary standards, and create Canadian national identity. And this is where it became interesting, because I looked through the early parts of the readers of the teachers' manuals only showed how many words and how to pronounce and how to teach kids to read. But when you actually got digging, you came across things like, it is time to begin to awaken and develop those feelings of love for and loyalty to Canada that rise out of a growing knowledge of her beauty, greatness, and lively history. The book as a whole must be Canadian in outlook. Great pains have been taken to inform the pupil of Canadian culture and Canadian achievement to the end that he may develop an admiration of and affection for Canada as his homeland. The aim has been to induce a healthy, vigorous, intelligent Canadianism. So the readers could be considered children's handbooks on Canadian citizenship, starting with the basics. Many grade 4 children do not know the name of our country. Fix this fact in their minds. Each reader contains a unit on Canada, and it's really those units I've concentrated on, but each reader contains 8 to 10 units with about, between 6 and 10 individual selections. They could be poems, they could be stories in each unit, so there would be about 100 different things in each book. In order to look at Canadian identity, I've concentrated on the units on Canada, but as I say, with some exceptions. Very few, less than 10% of the Canadian selections are set in urban locations. In some readers, no selections are set in urban locations. The cities are invariably characterized as noisy, dirty, and dangerous, places where small children and dogs are easily lost. The fact that I couldn't actually find any illustration to accompany this slide says it all. In contrast, rural and wilderness locations are healthy and beautiful. Now, at the time these books were produced, Canada's urban population in 1946 was 62%, and in 1976 was 76%. So the experience of the children in the urban areas is not reflected at all in the Canadian sections. That's one of the reasons they stopped being used. At least 90% of the Canadian selections are set in rural or wilderness locations. The rural stories could be located in any English-speaking country. They're mostly about loyalty to family, hard work, that kind of thing. It's the northern wilderness locations that impart the Canadian identity. The children are given a vocabulary to describe their country. Canada is our country. She is very beautiful. They're also given images of Canada, official images. 2,000 miles of forest, 1,000 miles of plain, 1,000 miles of mountain, and then the sea again. And the theme of Canada being vast, big, in total contrast to those islands that other people were talking about. And the same type of vocabulary continues through into the 1960s, the same kind of imagery. It's not just a product of the 1940s, it's continued right through the readers. Miles and miles of lakes and forest. Now, describing the North as a common heritage is one attempt to provide an official narrative of national identity and unity. The tales of our pioneer ancestors in the readers form the basis of this official narrative. They are always our ancestors, regardless of our background. And of course, this is part of the colonial structure, but that's actually another project. The pioneers clear the forests and transform the northern wilderness into our home. Explorers and traders do not settle but travel and survive in the north. They just pass through. It's the pioneers that create our home. To feel Canadian was to feel a part of a no man's land with huge rivers, lakes, and islands that few Canadians had ever seen. And again, on analyzing the text, it's the sprawling, vast, deeply wooded wilderness, the lonely land that dominates throughout the readers. That's the vocabulary children are given to consider Canada and think of themselves as Canadian within it. All that day they travel through a lonely, wild country. And these are the images that are the strongest within the readers. Now, the North is presented not as beautiful necessarily, but as the source of valuable resources to be harvested. There is no conservation message within this particular set of books, all 30 of them. There's nothing about environmentalism, conservation, or anything like that. The North is there to be used. And it's a recreation destination, gendered. And the site of numerous coming-of-age stories, including Lost in the Bush, where children are lost. Lucy Jane stopped and looked about her. She was in a part of the woods she had never seen before. "Why, I'm lost," she said to herself, but she was not much frightened. She was sure that her woods would not harm her. At the edge of the pine woods, all sign of a path had vanished. "It looks as if we're lost, Gail," Sally said. "I've lost all sense of direction, haven't you?" said Gail. "Not quite," said Sally, "but that's only because I've been watching the sun wherever we came to an open place." And it's not just girls. Boys are also lost in the woods, but they're all very competent. They're not permanently lost. Canadian children are not lost in the woods, but at home, in their North. They battle forest fires. They survive near-death experiences. They tame wild animals and ride on moose. The 1940s readers show young Canadians more at home in the Rockies or the boreal forests of the Canadian Shield, whereas the 1960s readers show young Canadians at home in the Arctic. And there are many units, and many of the readers contain units on the Arctic, which are quite separate from Canada. Is it Canada's Arctic? Is the Arctic part of Canada? In the 1940s readers, only the Inuit and polar bears inhabit the Arctic. There's no suggestion that southern children might even want to visit the Arctic. Inuit children are depicted as highly capable, especially at igloo construction. You could not get from grade 4 to grade 6 in Canada without knowing how to build an igloo. At all. And they're very confident at wilderness survival. One of the activities suggested in the teachers' manuals is the construction of igloos using paraffin melted over a bowl upside down. And we used to use sugar cubes to build our igloos. The 1960s readers show white children living in the Arctic and acquiring traditional Inuit skills and knowledge, although none seem to know how to build an igloo. Adults play very minor parts, except the bush pilot, hero of the Canadian North. The summary. And I've put this picture up as, and this was deliberately chosen as a summary. This is the flavor that children between ages 9 and 11 through the period were given of the North. The boy, it is a gendered location. The boy striding out across the boots, across the rock in his boots, carrying the 2 fishing poles. It's the recreational site. Notice that the adult is almost invisible in the back. The father, he's about a quarter the size of the boy, living in a rural place, obviously going out for fishing for lunch. There's only 2 fishing rods. You can guess that the boy's going to be using one of them or maybe both, with a little sister toting the lunchbox behind. This encapsulates the Canadian North as it was portrayed for the children in the readers. They provide Canadian school children with an official version of the North as a part of Canadian identity. Children are taught the correct vocabulary to describe their country. Canada is big, beautiful, free, and North. And children are provided with official images of Canada's North, the scenes of the wilderness populated by humans and animals. Children are shown their relationship with Canada's North, as you see the young boy striding out confidently. The North is their birthright because their pioneer ancestors cleared the wilderness and made it their home. 20th-century Canadian children are at home in the North, having acquired traditional Aboriginal skills and knowledge. Now, these particular readers come before the survival literature that dominates the survival themes that dominate Canadian literature. Nobody dies, nothing really bad happens. People are lost, but they're found. They fall in the water, they're pulled out. The bush plane goes down, the pilot manages to fix it with a little bit of duct tape, and they fly off again to survive. So it's a very different Canadian North to the Canadian North that we encounter in literature generally. It's a very specific kind of place. And as I told my wimpy British friend, young Canadians are not unduly concerned by the wolves howling outside the door. Our school readers taught us that we could easily escape and climb a tree, tame the beasts. She went back to England, believing that there were no wolves by that point. However, about a week after she left, I heard something I'd never heard before outside my little cabin. And the next day I looked out on the lake, and there it was, about the distance from here to the wall, and the Shimber wolf standing there watching me. So perhaps she had some basis after all. Those British Girls Annuals maybe had some truth in them. Anyway, this is academic light. I'm happy to take any questions. But I just wanted to give an overview of the readers as a source, as a potential source, because all of us have had school books at some point. All of us have acquired our interest in the North, or in my case, in the Canadian North, from some influences probably in our childhood. Whether it was the romantic North, it was the fear that my friend had. But the one thing with the school books is that they were the official version of the North for quite a long period of time. They went out of favor, the school readers went out of favor in the late 1970s, when it was much more of an individual form of education. The readers were discounted. The reading together in the classroom was discounted. Children were taught to read at their own speed, to learn at their own speed, take up whatever interested them. And one of my young friends described it as, there was a box of little books with worksheets, and you sort of pulled one out and worked through it. So there's no way of knowing what children after about the mid-1970s were exposed to as far as Canada's North and actually Canadian identity. It was one particular time and one particular body of literature, a package of material. Anyway, that's basically it.